Want a chance to win a Spring Creek Model Train's 25th anniversary car? Sign up for their newsletter before December 15th for your chance to win each week. The Spring Creek Model Train's newsletter includes new product announcements, pre-order information, specials, coupons, and more. With drawings held each week, the sooner you sign up, the more chances you have to win. Head to the bottom of the homepage at springcreekmodeltrains.com and sign up for your chance to win. If you own a protothrottle, it's time to upgrade your fascia with tullymodels.com fascia protothrottle holders. Experience safe, one-handed operation of your protothrottle and easily shift from engineer to conductor in a snap. With 4 available configurations to choose from, including integrated cup and pick stick holders, Tully Models has a holder for you. Don't have a protothrottle? No problem. TullyModels.com has fascia holders for Digitrax and NCE throttles and holders for your smartphone too. Check out the entire lineup at TullyModels.com. Fast forward into the future or bring a touch of the past to your layout with Rapido GP20 tank cars from Home Shops. Deliver clean and safe water to areas in critical need, just like the prototype with water-trained tank cars. These models represent a new, innovative solution to help solve water shortages across North America. Also available from Home Shops, Gargle Oil GP20 tank cars. This industry was a cornerstone of Frank Ellison's Delta lines, and these cars feature a classic 1970s look that pays tribute to the legacy of this inspiring freelance layout. Learn more about these cars and see the entire Home Shops catalog at homeshops.net. His amazing weathering and graffiti work has set social media ablaze, and now you'll get to hear from the artist himself. Join us for Around the Layout podcast live on Sunday, November 16th at 8 p.m. Eastern, when our guest will be Mike Correa. Mike will share how he brings ultra realism to his models and answers your questions live. Head to atlplive.com to subscribe and to be notified of this and all upcoming Around the Layout podcast live episodes. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining me on this episode, coming to us from Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, Kinzer Hurt. Kinzer, great to see you and have you on the show.
Hey, Ray. Glad to be here. We've been trying to get this together for quite a while now.
It has been a long while, and you came on my radar a long while ago, and thanks to our good friend Lance Minheim, who had pointed out, you wrote an article, and I think it was about a structure. Am I correct in saying that? I think it was in RMC.
Yeah, my first real publication was in Railroad Model Craftsman, December of 2022. I wrote an article about the warehouse model that I built for my shelf layout for the First Coast Railroad. And that was discovered by Otto Vondrak, the editor of RMC, on Facebook. And he got me to write a full-on article, and that got published a couple of years ago.
Awesome stuff. And I remember that article, and I remember Lance's reaction to it. And when you get the attention of Lance Minheim, it's always fun because you talk about who I think is, on that level of, celebrity model railroader. And when he pays attention to your article and says, boy, that's some really good stuff. And he was really enthusiastic about, the whole thought of the hobby's dying. And he's like, no, look at this. He's like, this guy is young and he's doing the hobby. And that's going to be a good part of what we talk about tonight is we've talked to a lot of model railroaders who took a break during college, and you did quite the opposite. So I'm really looking forward to diving into what you've done here with small layouts. I go back a little bit, and I'm curious, Kinzer. I mean, it hasn't been that long ago, so we're not going too far back. But what got you even started in the hobby?
I've been interested in trains since I was probably 2 years old, or even less. Probably before I even knew what a train was, I knew I liked them. Growing up in Orlando, we'd go to this hobby store called Colonial Photo and Hobby. And when I was a kid, we would go for the Thomas and Train section, but then I got older and I thought that the more realistic models looked really cool. And I would see all the different publications on the shelves, like books by Pele Soborg, all the model railroaders, the railroad model craftsmen. And I started getting those magazines and reading through them and seeing all the incredible stuff that people were modeling so realistically. And that's the part that I really like, is the realism and how you can scale down these incredible scenes and recreate them on your own.
How were you influenced into the hobby?
Yeah, when I was about 13, I think, is when I got a book by Pele Soborg called How to Build a Model Railroad. And I followed a lot of his steps really closely, and I built what I consider my first model railroad when I was 13. And it came out really well. I still use a lot of those methods today because they're just so effective. But that first layout I built was 4x8, just on some IKEA tables in the middle of the room. And it was pretty good. It had a loop. It had one industry track that kind of zigzagged through the middle. And on that layout too, I had scenes inspired by Lance Midheim's Miami layout. Because when I was a kid, my parents got me one of Lance's magazines, and I just thought his Miami scenes were incredible. I mean, growing up in Florida, I saw stuff like that all the time.
Yeah, we mentioned you're now in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, but you grew up in Orlando. And talk about, you mentioned some of the influence in the model railroading side. Were you influenced by the prototype as well? Were you doing any prototype rail fanning or anything like that? Was that on your radar?
In Orlando, there wasn't much going on. Occasionally, my dad and I would go out to this yard that was owned by the Florida Central Railroad, which is a local short line. And sometimes we would see them switching, but more often than not, we would just see all the cars in the yard sitting there. And we're both artists. My grandfather was an artist, and we liked to look at the graffiti and just see all the interesting tags going on. And there were some real masterpieces there, if you consider that masterpiece. It was really nice.
Graffiti is one of those controversial things, isn't it? Some people love it, people hate it. It's hard to deny talent, though, and whether you think they should be out painting cars or not, when you see this stuff, it really is pretty impressive.
Yeah, some of those guys really do have a lot of skill, and I try to replicate that too on some of my cars.
So you're one that is a modeler that's accepting to graffiti.
Yeah, if you can say that.
So talk about what else you saw there Orlando way, and tell me when First Coast Railroad got on your radar.
When I was growing up, my other grandfather had a condo on Amelia Island, which is where the First Coast Railroad exists. And we'd go up there pretty often. We would either go to Amelia Island for vacation, or we would go up to Brevard, North Carolina. And up in Brevard, we also had the Blue Ridge Southern, which is also a railroad that I model. But going to the First Coast Railroad, we would stay at this hotel called the Hampton Inn. It was right on the Amelia River waterfront. And if you've seen my layout, you know that between the hotel and the waterfront is the First Coast Railroad. So when you're staying at the hotel, when you're eating at the restaurant downtown called the Salty Pelican, you'll see those trains go by. And when I was a kid, I just thought that was the coolest thing ever, because those trains get really close to those buildings. You can walk right up to them. They go by really cool 50-foot boxcars, high cubes, which I know you like, just incredible scenes.
How much rail fanning did you get to do of the First Coast Railroad when you were younger?
Did a fair amount. It's a little hard to be a rail fan when you don't actually have a car. So when I was a kid, it was usually on family trips. I would ask my parents to drive by the train tracks or follow that train, and they were always really gracious about that.
So 13 years old, you mentioned you built your first layout, 4x8 layout, had a little bit of a siding, you said, kind of down the middle of it. And yeah, were you into any bit of operating that? Did you kind of grasp that concept early on?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting part of it, that first layout didn't really get into that much. But when I built that layout, I realized that I really did like that aspect of the hobby. And the wiring I had in that middle section wasn't too great, so the trains wouldn't run very well. But I planned a First Coast layout immediately after that one. That was in 2017 when I started the first Coast Railroad 1.0. And now in 2021 is when I started First Coast 2.0. So back then when I had the first layout of the First Coast Railroad is when I started thinking about operations and faithfully reproducing what I saw in real life. That first model railroad that I created wasn't really based on anything in particular. It was just a couple nondescript industrial scenes, but what I really wanted to do was get into modeling real places realistically. And so when I started the First Coast Railroad 2.0, I really wanted to get as accurate as I could with that.
When you started to head towards this more realistic thing, I know you talked about magazines and some of your influences. Was there anybody around you that was influencing this, or was it just from remote, i.e. magazines and other sources?
Yeah, I never really met anybody around me locally that was into model railroading until I went away to college. I learned that Tom Klomoski was pretty close by me. He was up in Northeast Georgia. I was going to college in Northwest South Carolina. And he was one of those model railroaders that I followed on YouTube. And YouTube is where I saw a lot of really great model railroading over the years. A lot of stuff that inspired me to do what I'm doing now. And so Tom Klomoski was one of those. And until college, I didn't really see any realistic model railroads in real life. But then when I went to Clemson for my degree in landscape architecture, Tom Klomoski was just a few hours away, so I went to his layout probably 3 times. And then through Tom Klomoski, I met Tom Johnson. We got connected there. So when I went back down to Florida for a holiday one year, I went down and I saw Tom Johnson's layout. And that is a truly incredible piece of work. But then through Tom Johnson, then I got connected again with Lance Mindheim. I went up and saw his layout. And since college, I've been involved in the NMRA, and I've been able to see a lot of really nice layouts all around South Carolina and North Carolina. Scott Lister is one example. He models the Greenville Northern in S scale, which S is not something you see very often, but he does it really well.
He certainly does. And you list a long string of great modelers. Let's go back to even sticking your neck out to meet Tom Klomoski. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's again one of those connections that was made online first. And it was through Paul Cassar's Shelf Modelers group on Facebook, actually. I posted some of my work on there, and a guy named Alex Bogaski reached out to me, and he's a part of a weekly/monthly Zoom call between a bunch of different model railroaders kind of in the Southeast and abroad. And I went on that Zoom call, introduced myself, and I showed people a little bit of what I did, and Tom Klomoski was on that. And so he sent me an email after the Zoom, and we just got to talking after that.
Talk about learning. And I guess this is what I'm kind of like, kind of inspired by and maybe slightly frustrated by, depending on which way you look at it. It's almost like you were kind of like you just started picking this up in so early. Did that feel like that to you, or was this kind of a gradual thing and I'm just missing something?
Yeah, in many ways, I'm lucky with the talent that I have. Maybe it's genetic. Like I said, my dad's an artist. My grandfather was an artist. We have artists going way back in our family. But when I started weathering at first, I used, the pan pastels, stuff like that, a little bit of spray paint. And honestly, it was not very good at the time. I was 13, maybe 14. And I still have some of those models. I just like to look at them and think, man, how far I've come. But I just kept working at it. Maybe when I was 15 or 16, I started getting a couple good boxcars, a couple good locomotives. And now it's something I can do where I pull up a couple prototype images, like Railroad Picture Archives, Railpics, and I'll just have the boxcar or whatever it is in front of me on the workbench. I'll put on a movie, split screen the movie, the prototype photos, and I'll just crank out a boxcar in an hour and a half.
From the age of 13, would you say that model railroading was like your only thing, or did you have other hobbies going on as well?
Yeah, I also had painting, I had piano. Model railroading, when I was growing up, it was kind of an even mix between those three hobbies. As I've gotten older, piano has kind of subsided, painting has kind of subsided, but model railroading, I've realized it incorporates so many other things that I'm also interested in that it's really taken the forefront of my hobbies.
Yeah, but do you think that the art, the piano, maybe that creative, I'm not sure which side, left brain, right brain, whichever side of the brain, like that was stimulating it, helped you in your model railroading journey?
Absolutely. Yeah, that the creative eye that I have definitely helps me with the modeling that I like to do, the kind of realistic prototypical modeling that I was talking about, and crafting scenes, laying things out proportionally, getting those colors right, the shapes, the angles right when I'm scratch building. It all kind of comes from that creative part of me that model railroading is really a great way to get that out there.
While you were doing those hobbies, I can imagine you didn't waste a whole lot of time, did you, with some of these other silly things that, seem to be time wasters. And it seems like you from early on were modeling and doing things with a lot of purpose.
Yeah, I got into it pretty quickly, pretty strongly. When I was in high school, I had a little room to the side that I would work on my model railroad after school. Even though I was really busy with school, I did like the AP program, advanced placement, the international baccalaureate program. So I was really busy with school. But even then, I made sure to find time to just get a couple things done on the layout where I could. And every little thing helps, build your skills. It helps you be connected to the hobby, even if you're just spending a few minutes between writing notes on history chapters.
So you talked about your first layout at 13, again, that 4x8 layout. And then you said in 2017, kind of set some time frame, because 2017 feels like it was like yesterday to me. And I actually struggle with understanding that the year 2000 was 25 years ago. So help me out here a little bit. When did that start to go away and in favor of your First Coast Railroad, the first version of the First Coast Railroad?
When I had kind of completed that very first layout, completed is in quotes. It's never always truly done, as we all know. Right. But when it was to a level that I thought I had finished it enough, and I was starting to get a little bit bored with it. Like I said, it was just a loop with an industry track in the middle. And at the same time, I was becoming really inspired by the First Coast Railroad. I started planning that First Coast 1.0 layout. And instead of in the middle of the room 4x8, I moved the IKEA tables it was on to the outside of the room. So I started gravitating towards the shelf layout concept. And I was pretty early on in the planning phases for that layout when my inspiration for the First Coast was actually overtaken by my inspiration by the Blue Ridge Southern Railroad. And like I said, growing up, we would go to Western North Carolina for vacation a lot. And starting in 2014, the Blue Ridge Southern Railroad started operating out of Asheville. And I thought that railroad was very cool. Nice black and yellow locomotives, but the way that they just charge up the mountain going to Canton to service that huge paper mill, which has since closed, unfortunately. But that mountain scenery was incredible to me. And so that First Coast 1.0 layout was actually overtaken by the beginnings of my Blue Ridge Southern layout. And that one was maybe about 50% complete when high school ended and it was time to go off to college. And when I went to college in upstate South Carolina, my parents just said, forget about Orlando. Let's just move to our vacation spot in the mountains. So they moved up there to North Carolina. I was up in South Carolina. And that is also the same time the pandemic hit. So I don't know if you remember, but everybody was inside for months and months and months.
Yeah, hard to forget. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
it's a
Yeah.
hard thing in a lot of ways, but if there was one thing it was really good for, it was working on the model railroad. And when I was up there, I had just moved to a brand new city, I didn't really know anybody up there. And because of the pandemic, we couldn't really hang out at school or be in classes. And so on the weekends, I would just go to my parents' house. And on Saturdays, pretty often, I would drive up to see the Blue Ridge Southern because they were still operating, pandemic or not, the freight has to move. And so I would chase them back and forth between Canton and Asheville over and over again. And I thought it was so cool. And so at our new house in North Carolina, I started building my kind of real Blue Ridge Southern layout. And that layout is 14 by about 17 feet, double decker, peninsula, helix. It has it all. It's a pretty big layout, but I've built it all from scratch by myself since 2020. And just this past summer, started laying out some of the scenery, got my first water feature poured. But simultaneously, as I was working on that layout, I had never really lost that interest in the First Coast layout or Florida modeling. So the times when I couldn't be up at my parents' house working on the Blue Ridge Southern layout, I would be looking for something to do at my apartment in Clemson. And so when I was in college, I had this little 2-foot by 10-foot alcove in my apartment. And luckily, I didn't have any roommates. This might have been a different scenario if I had a lot of roommates, but it was my own place. I could do whatever I wanted. And so in this little 2-foot by 10-foot alcove, I built the First Coast Railroad 2.0, which is the one that many people have seen because it's been published twice now, once on the cover and once as a little story about that warehouse.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing that you have a love for the First Coast, and then you see this Blue Ridge Southern, and then you decide, and I guess this is kind of the beauty of these small shelf layouts, that you don't have to be faithful to one railroad, and you can kind of dabble in both, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think that's why shelf layouts are really interesting to me, is because I'm so interested in so many different short lines across the United States. I mean, I have an Instagram account called Scale Shortlines where I post all these things, but currently I'm modeling 3 short line railroads. Like we've talked about Blue Ridge Southern, the First Coast already, but I'm also modeling the Hartwell Railroad. And there's even more that I might get to someday, but for now I've got those 3 layouts, and shelf layouts are a perfect way to let me experience all those different scenes, all those different railroads, and each one has a very different character that interests me the same. And so because of shelf layouts, making smaller things instead of one giant basement empire where you have to pick one thing and go with it, with a shelf layout, or multiple shelf layouts rather, you can pick multiple different locales.
That open-minded thing is tough, isn't it? When you don't have something that you're so in love with that you can't see anything else, that it's just that. And I think sometimes I've said that I envy those people, but and there's nothing wrong with that. If you're laser focused on a railroad, certainly run with it. But
yeah, absolutely.
Boy, you can also have a lot of fun being open-minded too. And you're proving that.
Yeah. I just love the variety that you can see in all sorts of short lines across the United States. I mean, there's so many in every state, and each one is different from the last. I mean, up in South Carolina, where I was at Clemson, I had 4 different short lines within 45 minutes of me. One of them being the Hartwell Railroad, with those who know that it has a Conrail locomotive, it has the EJ&E, it has Chicago Northwestern, Rio Grande, all in their original paint schemes, still running down there in Georgia, just, moving grain around and plastics and storage cars.
Begging to be modeled.
Yeah, just an incredible railroad. But besides that one, there was also the Greenville and Northern, which uses a couple Jeeps including a GP30 with a sharp paint scheme that's white and green. And then connected to that one, you have the Pickens Railroad with
Oh, the Pickens.
U18Bs. Yep,
Yes,
still running
yes.
around. And then besides those, you also have the Carolina Piedmont Railroad, which is like the First Coast, owned by the Genesee and Wyoming. So you have that black, orange, and yellow paint scheme. But just in those four examples, I mean, each one is so different from the last, and they're all compelling to me.
Yeah, and I can see why. I know, I spent some time in Anderson, South Carolina. My grandparents lived there for quite some time, and I remember my first look at the Pickens and them bright orange. What were they, like U-boats or something? Help me
Yeah, the
out
baby
there. Yeah.
boats.
Yeah, and just seeing that and the big pick right across the front of the nose, and it just popped. And yeah, that is another short line that just begs to be modeled. And you've rattled off quite a few. Talk about learning about those prototypes and the process you went through there, and how you got to know so many of these short lines.
YouTube is a great avenue for that. A lot of great railfan channels out there post really high quality videos of interesting short lines. I found ones all over the eastern seaboard that are like super cool operations that I would have no idea even existed if it wasn't for some of these YouTube channels. But other things like just exploring on Google Maps. Something I like to do is just follow a railroad line around, and occasionally can jump down in the street view and just see what things look like down there. And I've also been lucky enough that I can travel a lot. I've been to about 38 states in my life so far, which has all been an incredible experience. But everywhere I go, I try to seek out a short line if I can. I, see them a couple times. Maybe I'll chase them if I have the time. But even just seeing them and exploring different places brings me a lot of joy.
Do you happen to have a favorite? Is there, can you pin a favorite, or you have so much enjoyment with so many diverse railroads that are on your radar? Can you pin one down as an absolute favorite?
Well, that's a tough question, but honestly, I think since I've discovered the Hartwell Railroad, it's probably my favorite. When I turned 21, I'm 23 now, almost 24. So I was in college and I discovered that the Hartwell Railroad was only about 45 minutes to an hour away from me. Again, thanks to YouTube. I found that out with the just Discover page. But I saw that railroad on YouTube. I thought, wow, that is incredible. And so when I had the opportunity, I got in the car, drove over to the town of Toccoa, Georgia, and then I followed their main line down to Livonia and Bowersville, where their kind of headquarters is. And driving down there, I saw all their cool locomotives. And I was lucky enough, they have a pretty rare running schedule, but I was lucky enough to find them, chase them several miles, and it was just an incredible experience. And so because of my landscape architecture studio schedule, I had Friday mornings off. And coincidentally, that was also when the Hartwell was usually running. And so many, many times throughout college, I would go over to the Hartwell Railroad and just see them running. Sometimes it was only for an hour. Sometimes it was the whole day, and I'd be late to studio. But it was such an incredible experience every time.
Your love now for the Hartwell Railroad, when you were building the second edition of the First Coast Railroad, any temptations to change it to the Hartwell Railroad, or were you pretty much set that what you were building was going to be First Coast?
By the time I discovered the Hartwell Railroad, I was already pretty close to being done with the First Coast layout. And I still had a couple things left to build on the First Coast, but it was at such a far along point that I didn't want to just turn back, because I had this vision in my head of what the final product would look like, and I was really inspired to push through and get to that spot. But when the First Coast layout was done, I started planning for this future Hartwell layout. And then after college, I lived in the city of Greenville, South Carolina for about a year. And while I was there, I started building that Hartwell layout. And I built it modular. The First Coast layout is 2 feet by 10 feet but it's all one big piece, which makes it a little bit hard to move, especially when, like me, you live on the fourth floor of an apartment building.
Yeah, that makes it a little tough to move 10 feet around, that's for sure.
Yeah, it won't fit in any elevators. It also does not fit in a 10-foot U-Haul because little did I know they're actually 9'11" inside. But when I got to that new place in Greenville, I started building the Hartwell layout. My girlfriend and I had a little hobby room that I kind of commandeered. But I started building that layout kind of L-shaped, modular, with the thought that maybe I could expand on it a little bit later. And when we moved to North Carolina, because she started going to Duke for med school, we had a little bit more extra space. And so now I'm at the point where I can continue expanding on that layout. And because it's modular, it was so easy to move it up here. And I can just, keep this hobby going no matter where I live.
So perhaps maybe one of the biggest lessons out of the First Coast Railroad was either make it 9'11" so it'll fit in a U-Haul, or make it a little bit more modular to port it around.
Yeah, my lesson was try not to build anything longer than about 6 feet. I think 7 was the maximum that I made the Hartwell layout, one chunk at least. And that whole layout, the Hartwell layout, is about 10 feet long with a little 8-foot L.
Let's go back to the First Coast again. And, I'm looking at, as we're talking here, the August 2025 edition of Railroad Model Craftsman. Awesome article you wrote here. Cover of Railroad Model Craftsman. That must have been just an amazing thing. You talk about all these amazing modelers that influenced you, and now look at you right on the front cover of this awesome magazine.
Yeah, it's such an honor. I mean, like I said, growing up in Orlando, we would go to that hobby store called Colonial Photo and Hobby, and I would see all these magazines and just be so inspired. And I always thought, oh man, it would be so cool if I was ever on the cover of one of these magazines, or if I had my own feature story. And when I had my first article in 2022, I was ecstatic. And I just thought, like, man, how could it be any better than this? And then a couple years later, when I finished the First Coast layout, I reached back out to Otto of RMC and I said, hey, you want me to write a full-on article for this one? And he said, absolutely. So I wrote the article, took all the pictures, photoshopped the skies to make them look realistic, and got published with the full-on cover. And it's been a great experience working with Otto, being published in Railroad Model Craftsman. They have a really great magazine going on. And it was just so surreal to walk around some of the bookstores here and just see Kinzer Hurt's First Coast on the cover of this publication. It's so cool.
I can only imagine how awesome it is to walk in and see that. I was just tickled when I got a small article put in a couple times. I was like, oh, this is so cool. But you got the cover. I mean, this is really, really cool stuff. Let's go back to building that layout. And I want to start with track plan and in this concept of small shelf layout, because personally, I love the concept because now there's no excuse, right? I mean, 2 foot by 10 foot, you're in college, it's an apartment, but yet you're still finding a way to model railroad. And I hope that inspires a lot of people to say, I can too. Let's talk about the process you went through to design and build the First Coast Railroad 2.0 in your apartment. And again, let's start with that track plan and how you developed this concept to be able to do some operations on it as well.
I started planning it using this program called AnyRail, which it allows you to have a free trial as long as you use less than 50 pieces of track, which for a shelf layout is very easy to do. So I was using that program to design, but I was getting all the direct inspiration from Google Maps. The aerials that they have, if you hold shift and click and drag, you can kind of change the perspective. You can rotate the map. So I would rotate it to have the Amelia River at the bottom, the town of Fernandina Beach at the top. And I started marking out a 2 foot by 10 foot area on AnyRail and kind of picking quadrants from Google Maps that I could replicate in AnyRail. So when I was modeling the First Coast Railroad, I knew I wanted to model that main scene in downtown Fernandina Beach where the trains cross paths with the restaurant. They go past the hotel and they end up at the warehouse. So I knew I wanted to model that section. The hard part was cutting out some stuff. I had to make the warehouse a lot shorter than it was in real life. I took out a lot of negative space, but I still left enough to make it feel like there was a distance between the downtown and the warehouse. And so I started with AnyRail. I ended up having a pretty good plan set up in AnyRail that mimicked the prototype track layout. And when I had that plan with all the turnouts, all the track lengths I needed, I started building the First Coast layout using 1x2 pine, a couple of sheets of 1-inch foam insulation board. And when I had that plain table-like structure, I would just kind of draw on the foam using the AnyRail plan as kind of a guide. And I would draw on the foam just using a Sharpie. I would place some boxcars around, place the locomotives around. And I also printed out scale copies of all the buildings that I wanted to have on the layout. And so I stuck those to some cardboard, just placed them on the foam, and I just would look at it from different angles to see how it felt and see how things would work in scale.
So this wasn't just a digital approach to planning it. You physically got the cardboard out, cut out all this, basically the footprints of everything, and use that to start making your final determinations on track planning and building location.
Yeah, mock-ups are a great way to figure out your scene before you actually commit to building things for real. Because sometimes if you don't make a mock-up, maybe you go for a kit, you build it all completely, but then you realize it doesn't quite fit the scene, and then you don't want to go in after the fact and have to cut a chunk off of it or something, So making these mock-ups, looking at it from all sorts of different angles. I also took my phone and I kind of mocked up the photos that I knew I'd probably be taking of the layout and seeing how that scale worked out. And then when I had those mock-ups kind of arranged how I thought they should be arranged, then I started actually building them out of styrene. And all the structures are completely scratch built from styrene. They're all painted by hand, but it was because of that mock-up, each mock-up, that I knew the size of each.
Is this a complete build from beginning to end, or were you able to pull any pieces off the first edition of the First Coast Railroad, or was this just completely start over again?
That First Coast 1.0 never really got beyond the foam board stage, except I did make number 437, that main locomotive that they used at the time with the funky front. And I also was able to make the Salty Pelican restaurant because that was such a special place for me. And that first rendition of the Salty Pelican, I actually built it a little too tall. And so for the First Coast 2.0, I took it back to the workbench, cut it down a little bit, reassembled it, and it was perfect for the 2.0 layout.
Talk about rail-served industries on this, because you've put quite a few buildings on this layout that really don't interact with the railroad.
Yeah, most of the buildings there are just kind of like a display for the model railroad itself. And so I only have one building, which is the warehouse, that's actually rail-served. And the port, too, if you can call that an industry. I might send one car there every once in a while. But really the only building on the layout that's rail-served is that warehouse. And besides the warehouse, you have the Salty Pelican restaurant, you have the Marina Seafood restaurant, the depot, that's now the visitor center, and the Hampton Inn, which is that hotel. They all just contribute so strongly to the sense of place of Fernandina Beach that I had to include them, and I had to be faithful about their reproductions.
Did all the research come from using Google Maps? Did you do any site visits to be able to do this, or was that just not possible, so you resorted to using Google Maps because it was available?
Over the years, I was able to visit Amelia Island quite a lot. Like I said, my grandfather had a condo there for a while, and so we would visit there as a family pretty often. But as I got older, we moved out of Florida into North Carolina. It was a little bit harder to go back there. But right before I started building First Coast 2.0. And as I was building it, my girlfriend and I went down there for our first and second anniversary. And so on those trips, I was able to see those places again and take a lot more high quality pictures, kind of feel the space with a new mindset. And I used a lot of that inspiration when I was actually building it for real in 2.0.
It wasn't a happy anniversary, hold the end of this ruler kind of trip, was it?
Nope. I did not bring the tape measure. I don't think I even brought the scanner the first couple trips.
Excellent. But you did get a feel for it and you were able to bring that back and as you're building this. And so you talk about the track plan, you're laying that out, you're getting the buildings, you scratch build them. What kind of time frame are we talking about here? You know, you said you were doing this while you were in college. How long did it take to kind of walk through this process to where you were with scenery?
So I started initial construction in October of 2021, and I worked on it for a couple of years. Then I had to take some time off away from the layout because I was doing study abroad. It's kind of hard to work on your layout when you're in a different country. But when I got back home, I kept working on it, and I would say it was finished probably 2023. So solid 2.5 years worth of construction time from start until basically done. And that includes all the scenery and the scratch building of all those different structures.
You've been at the hobby since 13. When you went abroad, how did you you must have been chomping at the bit to get back and work on this. How'd you hold yourself over?
It was tough for sure. But when I was doing study abroad, it was just such an incredible experience. Clemson actually owns a villa in Italy. And so that's where I went with all the other landscape architecture and architecture students. We lived there for 4 months and got to travel on trains, which was fun. Just got to see all the sights, but really we were so busy all the time that it was the layout was barely on my mind. But even then I was able to look at YouTube, to get my United States train fix. I could kind of plan things out. Maybe I probably bought a few things on eBay and shipped them to my parents' house while I was away. But when I got back, I was definitely very ready to get back to working on my favorite hobby.
Speaking of favorite, what would you say is your favorite part of the hobby? Is it scenery? Is it structure building? Is it track laying? What's your favorite part of it?
For me, it's kind of a toss-up between weathering and scenery. I feel like those two things really go hand in hand with the realism aspect of everything that I enjoy. I can say for sure my least favorite is the electrical. I'm sure a lot of people relate to that. But track work, I do enjoy. But to me, it's not the most important part. To me, it's the weathering of the locomotives, the cars, and then the scenery that they pass through is huge for me.
You have this layout you're building in your college apartment. When people saw this, did you find any like people at Clemson, any other fellow model railroaders who could appreciate this?
When I was building the Blue Ridge Southern layout and the First Coast layout, I actually applied for the Walthers Model Railroading Scholarship, and I won, and I was one of the first people, I think, to win that scholarship. But simultaneously that year, another Clemson student also applied and won. So it's kind of crazy that first year there were two people from Clemson University that won the Walthers Model Railroading Scholarship. But when I was there, I met a couple classmates that liked trains. Sometimes they would come over to my apartment and realize they didn't like trains quite as much as I did. But everyone that came over and saw the layout, they just thought it was so cool. People love seeing these little models, and especially if they're, super realistic and detailed and there's interesting scenes going on. Everybody is just fascinated. It doesn't matter if they actually like trains or not. They just think it's really cool.
I want to go back a little bit. We talked about some of the big names in the hobby, and by the way, you're going to be one of those big names. You're certainly on your way. Why don't we just talk about a few of these here in kind of the lessons learned from them? Let's start with Lance Minheim and what you learned from Lance as you're continuing down your model railroading journey.
So growing up, I saw his Miami layout. By the time I got interested in the hobby, it was a little bit after his East Rail layout, which was kind of famous. But his Miami layout is the first one I saw, and his reproduction of real life I thought was incredible. I mean, he had the weeds, the trash between the rails, all the rust, the debris, everything. He got the grittiness of everything perfectly accurate, which I thought was so cool. And he described his process of structure building as kind of making shells that he would then stick laminated photos to. And it was kind of a way to circumvent the arduous scratch building task, where you could kind of use real life itself to enhance your modeling. And that's one thing that I took with me when I started building all these structures for the First Coast layout. I still made all the walls out of styrene and I painted them by hand. But when I needed to do the signs or the awnings or the windows especially, I would go to Google Maps, go to Street View, go to pictures that I had actually taken, and then just print those out at scale and stick them to the buildings. And it just enhanced the realism by so much because it was real. It's just a picture of the real thing scaled down, and it complements the scratch building that I did.
Excellent. Now, how about Tom Johnson? You talk about Orlando. We know Tom Johnson in Orlando with a beautiful layout that he's got, the Cass County. Talk about lessons learned from Tom.
Yeah, that's an incredible piece of artwork. It really is. And he was an art teacher for many years, and it really shows with his modeling. He's nailed all the colors that you can find in various scenery. He nailed the textures. He has so many different interesting scenes with little details that I really admire. And going to his layout, it was really eye-opening to see all the detail that you could create in such a small space. And his layout is so realistic, and it's really incredible to see.
And how about Tom Kolmoski? We've had Tom Kolmoski on the podcast, and we've learned so much from him. But what would you say is the biggest lesson taken from Tom?
Tom, I followed his videos on YouTube for a long time, and he produced a lot of videos on his operations of his model railroad. He models the Georgia Northeastern in HO scale, but his room is probably about 10 feet by 12 feet. So again, it's not a massive basement empire, but with his YouTube videos, he was able to reproduce these perfect operations in HO scale, and it feels so much larger than it really is. The first time walking into that room, I was like, oh, wow, can't really stick my arms out here. But his YouTube videos are just great, the way that he portrays these scenes in realistic time. He's big on prototypical operations. So he has a proto throttle. He has a speed limit for all his locomotives. He's very precise with the operations themselves. He has a switch list for all these different industries. And I just think it's really interesting how even with a relatively small layout, you can still get incredible operations.
We've talked to quite a few folks here on the podcast who have started small with aspirations of a big layout and working their way towards that. But you mentioned off the top of your head 4 or 5 amazing short line railroads. Do you foresee yourself ever going towards that empire, or do you see this kind of being the way you're going to do things for the foreseeable future, which is building your smaller layouts and being able to have that diversity?
I feel like I absolutely could roll with multiple shelf layouts, for a long time. But with the experiences that I had in Clemson and all those different short lines around me, and how they were all sort of connected with the Norfolk Southern Greenville District and CSX, I think it would be incredible if I could have that kind of basement empire space and yet at the same time have multiple railroads in one space. Like the Norfolk Southern Greenville District, it goes from Atlanta to Greenville. And along that line, you have connecting the Hartwell Railroad, the Pickens, and then the Greenville and Western connects to the Pickens. And so on this one stretch of Class 1 main line, you can still have different points branching off, like maybe different peninsulas where you can explore all those different short lines. And it'd be a great freelance opportunity too for those who are interested in freelancing to model one of those class ones and then have different splits where multiple short lines can come in, interchange cars. You can even have little spurs where you model the short line itself. And I feel like that is kind of an interesting intersection between the shelf layout and the basement empire. It's kind of all in one.
One of the challenges, it seems, in the hobby, especially for major organizations and clubs and the like, is the question of what does the youth and model railroading want? And I'm not saying that you're necessarily the youth, you're a young man, but what do the younger people want? And are you able to, from that aspect, kind of pin down what the trend is going to be in the hobby, especially for the younger folks that are participating?
There are definitely a lot of young people that are interested in this hobby. The hobby is definitely not dying out. It may be fading away for the moment, but I know for sure there's a lot of people who have incredible skills, and any day now they're going to come to the forefront of the hobby. And one of the biggest barriers, I think, for young people is the cost of model railroading these days. It's getting more and more difficult for a lot of people to be able to afford the hobby. And you have locomotives now that are $350. But with that kind of pricing, that's when a shelf layout can truly shine, because you don't need a huge fleet of trains. All you really need, like in my layout, I just have 2 locomotives for the First Coast. I only had 1 for a long time until Intermountain released their GP16. But that limited space, like young people are having a hard time buying houses of their own now. It's getting more and more difficult to do that. The price of things just going crazy, but being able to scale back and still work on the hobby is definitely possible. And I think it's still very fulfilling.
It's an evolution, isn't it? And I like to call it or I like to say that the hobby isn't dying, it's evolving and becoming something else. And it's all part of the ebb and flow, isn't it?
Yeah. And, it may be a lot of people see, the NMRA, you see a lot of gray hair and think, oh, everyone's 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. But even if the young people aren't involved in these organizations, they're still involved in the hobby. And maybe it just takes some time for them to realize the importance of these organizations like the NMRA.
Well, I think price is only an issue in the absence of value, my favorite saying. And I think the same thing for youth getting to understand it. And it's really up to us to start asking the questions instead of assuming, right? And start to ask younger modelers what it is they need versus us telling them what they need. They know. We just need to ask them. Yeah.
And I've really enjoyed being a part of the NMRA. I was in the upstate South Carolina group for a year when I lived there. And now I'm in the Central North Carolina group, CPD 13. And everyone in both of these groups has just been so supportive and interested in what I'm doing. Everyone's so kind and willing to help out wherever they can. It's really a great community. And it's fun too. You can bring your models and show them off. And instead of just posting on Facebook, you can actually have real people reacting to your models. And through these organizations too, you can actually visit layouts. If you don't meet somebody through Facebook or something like that, you can meet them through the NMRA and be able to see all these incredible layouts that really they're a lot more numerous than you'd think they were. I mean, I'm just astounded by how many layouts there are all over the place. It's incredible, really.
There are more model railroads than we'll ever know about. And I do a lot of traveling, and I think about that as I drive through neighborhoods, like, where's the model railroad in this neighborhood that nobody's talked about? The person's never come out of the basement, never talked about it, never told a friend. Where are they? I know they're out here somewhere, but always good when you stick your head out there. And that's what you did. And I think that's a huge lesson for those listening. You stuck your neck out there. And from that, look at the amazing folks that now you can call friends and your peers, the Lance Minheims and the Tom Klomoskis and the Tom Johnsons, etc. that you now are standing side by side with model railroading and sharing information with.
Yeah, if I had just kept to myself and not posted my work on Facebook or Instagram or, brought it to different shows, I never would have been able to be a part of all these different communities and all these model railroading legends across the US. I mean, there's so many people out there who have commented on my work, and it's really great to see the kind of reach that I can have over social media. And it's great to hear the feedback of everyone who's, enjoying the stuff I do. They ask questions about how I built stuff or where I got things. And I love answering those questions and connecting with all these people.
Speaking of that, why don't you tell us where we can find more about Kinzer and the First Coast and all these other projects that you're working on?
I have a YouTube channel. It's just called Kinzer. I post occasionally updates of the First Coast. I've posted a few videos of my Hartwell locomotives on Tom Klomoski's layout. I'll occasionally post some real-life railfan videos as well. But I have posted most frequently on Instagram over the past couple of years under the account scale_shortlines. And I'm just about at 2,500 followers. And I started that account back in October of 2021 when I started building the First Coast layout to kind of keep track of that, almost like a virtual diary of my progress.
Awesome stuff. And we'll share links on our website, aroundthelayout.com/196. Definitely follow along and then go and find yourself a copy. It wasn't all that long ago, August 2025. The Railroad Model Craftsman of the First Coast Railroad. Learn more about that. We just skimmed the surface. We have only an hour here, and boy, we could just go probably another hour talking about all these railroads and the work you've done. And I have a feeling we're going to have you back more than once, more than twice, to hear all of these awesome projects that you're working on as you continue to build these short line small shelf layouts and collect these up and build just amazing modeling coming out of Kinzer Hurt. So glad we were able to have you on Around the Layout podcast to be able to share your story.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.